I never thought I'd find anything interesting about car trouble until the day my engine light came on, and I pulled into Barrett's auto shop on the edge of town. I'd driven past it 100 times, always meaning to find a regular mechanic. And that morning it just seemed like fate when my car started making that awful knocking sound right as I passed the hand-painted sign. The shop smelled like motor oil and coffee, and when I walked in, wiping sweat from my forehead, because it was already hot at 9 in the morning, I saw him for the first time. Barrett was under the hood of a pickup truck, and all I could see were his oil-stained jeans and work boots. Then he straightened up, wiped his hands on a rag tucked into his belt, and looked at me with these impossibly green eyes that seemed to cut right through the dim garage lighting. He was maybe 30, with dark hair that curled slightly at the ends, and perpetual stubble that made him look like he'd just rolled out of bed. There was a tattoo peeking out from under his sleeve, something tribal or geometric I couldn't quite make out. He smiled, and it was the kind of smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the world right then. I'm Marcus, by the way. 27, graphic designer, the kind of guy who knows absolutely nothing about cars except where to put the gas and how to turn on the windshield wipers. Standing there in Barrett's garage, I felt acutely aware of how clean my hands were, how my button-down shirt probably cost more than his entire outfit, how utterly out of place I was. "So what's wrong with her?" he asked, nodding toward my car through the open bay door. His voice was rough, textured, like he'd spent years shouting over engine noise. I explained about the engine light and the knocking sound, probably using all the wrong words, and he just nodded, grabbed his keys, and said, "Let's take a look." I followed him outside, watching the way he moved with this easy confidence, like every step was exactly where it needed to be. He popped my hood and leaned in, and I found myself staring at the way his shirt stretched across his shoulders, the way his forearms flexed as he checked various components I couldn't name. He asked me to start the engine, and when I did, he tilted his head, listening with this intense focus that made me realize I'd never really paid attention to anything the way he was paying attention to my car right then. After a minute, he straightened up and said he needed to get under the dash, check some connections. He asked if I wanted to see what he was looking at, and I said sure, even though I knew I wouldn't understand any of it. I just wanted to be near him, which was a thought that surprised me as soon as I had it. We both got into my car, him in the driver's seat and me in the passenger seat, and he scooted down, his head disappearing under the steering column. I heard him grunt a little, adjusting position, and then he said, "Come here, you should see this." I leaned over, trying to peer under the dash where he was pointing, and suddenly we were in this incredibly small space together. His shoulder pressed against my chest as I leaned in. I could smell him. This mix of motor oil and sweat and something else. Something clean underneath it all. Maybe just laundry detergent, but it made my head swim. He was pointing at something, explaining about a loose connection. And I was nodding like I understood, but really I was just hyper-aware of how close we were, how his breath was warm in the confined space, how our legs were tangled together in the footwell, because there was simply no other way to both fit. I felt his hand brush against my knee as he reached for a tool, and it was like an electric shock. He didn't move his hand right away, just left it there for a second, maybe 2 seconds, maybe an eternity. I couldn't breathe. Then he shifted, reaching further under the dash, and his thigh pressed against mine, solid and warm through our jeans. "You see it?" he asked, and his voice was quieter now, almost intimate in the enclosed space. I managed to say yeah, even though I was looking at a tangle of wires that meant absolutely nothing to me. What I was really seeing was the curve of his jaw, the way his Adam's apple moved when he swallowed, the small scar above his left eyebrow. He turned his head slightly, and suddenly we were face to face, maybe 6 inches apart. His eyes met mine and something passed between us. some understanding or question or recognition. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure he could hear it. Neither of us moved. The air in the car felt thick, charged, with something I didn't want to name because naming it would make it real, and making it real would mean I had to deal with it. Then a car horn honked somewhere outside, and the moment shattered. Barrett cleared his throat and pulled back, extracting himself from under the dash with practiced ease. I sat up too, trying to calm my racing pulse, trying to pretend that whatever just happened hadn't happened at all. He said he could fix it, would take about an hour, and I said that was fine. He quoted me a price that seemed incredibly reasonable, and I said great, trying to sound normal, trying to sound like a regular customer who hadn't just had some kind of moment with his mechanic in the front seat of his own car. I waited in the small office area, pretending to look at my phone but really watching him work through the window. He moved with such purpose, such competence. Every action was efficient and sure. I'd never found manual work particularly attractive before, but watching Barrett's hands as he worked, watching the concentration on his face, something in my chest tightened. I'd dated women in college, had a serious girlfriend for 2 years who I thought I might marry. When that ended, I told myself I just needed time, needed to focus on my career. But sitting in that garage office, watching Barrett, I felt something I'd never quite felt before. Or maybe I had felt it, and just never let myself acknowledge it. When he finished, he came to get me, wiping his hands again on that same rag. He walked me through what he'd fixed, explaining it in simple terms, never making me feel stupid for not knowing. His hand rested on the open car door as he talked, and I found myself staring at his fingers, imagining what they might feel like against my skin. I paid him, our fingers brushing as he handed me my receipt, and he said if I had any more problems to come back. The way he said it felt loaded, like he was saying something more than just come back if your car acts up. Or maybe I was reading into it, projecting my own sudden confusion onto him. I drove away but couldn't stop thinking about him. That night, lying in bed, I replayed the moment under the dash over and over. The way our legs had tangled, the way he'd looked at me, the way my body had responded to his nearness. I told myself it didn't mean anything. I told myself I was just lonely, just stressed from work, just manufacturing feelings that weren't really there. But 3 days later, when my car was running perfectly fine, I found myself driving past his shop. And then, the next day, and the day after that. On the 5th day, I invented a problem with my brakes and pulled in. Barrett looked up from the engine he was working on and smiled when he saw me. "Back so soon?" he asked, and there was something knowing in his voice, something that made my stomach flip. I explained about the brakes, probably not very convincingly, and he said, "Let's check it out." This time when we got in the car, the air felt different, heavier, like we both knew what was really happening but neither of us wanted to say it. He pumped the brakes a few times, tested them, and said they seemed fine to him, but he could take a closer look. We ended up under the dash again, ostensibly so he could check the brake line connections. Our legs tangled the same way, our bodies pressed close in that small space. But this time, when his hand brushed my knee, it didn't feel accidental. It lingered. His thumb moved slightly. Just a tiny movement, barely anything, but it sent heat racing through my entire body. I turned to look at him, and he was already looking at me. We stayed like that, frozen, the tension so thick I could barely breathe. Then he said very quietly, "I don't usually do this." I didn't know what this was, but I nodded anyway. "Me neither," I whispered back. His hand moved from my knee to my thigh, deliberate now, no pretense of accident. I could feel the calluses on his palm through my jeans. My hand found his forearm, gripping it. and I felt his muscles tense under my fingers. We were still just looking at each other, neither of us moving closer, but neither of us pulling away. "What are we doing?" I asked, my voice barely audible. He shook his head slightly. "I don't know," he said, "but I've been thinking about you since the first time you came in." The admission hung between us, honest and vulnerable. "I've been thinking about you too," I said, and saying it out loud made it real in a way that terrified and exhilarated me. He pulled back then, extracting himself from the footwell, and for a moment I thought he was ending it, whatever it was. But instead, he held out his hand to help me up, and when I took it, he didn't let go. We stood there beside my car in the empty garage bay, holding hands like teenagers, and my heart was doing things I didn't know hearts could do. "Come back tonight," he said, "after I close. We can talk." I nodded, not trusting my voice. He squeezed my hand once and then let go, stepping back, putting professional distance between us again. But his eyes stayed on mine, and in them I saw the same confusion and want and fear that I felt. I left and spent the rest of the day unable to focus on anything. My design work sat untouched on my computer. I kept checking the clock, watching the minutes crawl by. I thought about not going back. I thought about all the reasons this was complicated and scary, and potentially life-changing. But more than anything, I thought about the way Barrett had looked at me, the way his hand had felt on my thigh, the way my entire body had come alive under his touch. I showed up at 7, just as he was pulling down the bay doors. He saw my car and smiled. And it was different from his other smiles. More private, more real. He let me in through the side door and locked it behind us. The garage felt different at night, quieter, more intimate with just the security lights casting long shadows. We stood there for a moment, neither of us quite sure how to start. Then he said, "You want a beer?" And I said yes, even though I barely drink beer. We sat on a bench in the corner of the garage, shoulders touching, drinking cheap beer from cans and started talking. He told me about growing up in a small town 2 hours away, about always knowing he was different but not having words for it, not having anyone to talk to about it. He told me about his ex-girlfriend who he'd almost married before he finally admitted to himself what he really wanted. He told me about moving here 5 years ago, starting over, being honest with himself, even if he wasn't always honest with everyone else. I told him about my relationship with Sarah, about how I'd loved her, but something had always felt slightly off, like I was playing a role I'd learned but never quite embodied. I told him I'd never really let myself think about men that way, never let myself acknowledge the feelings I sometimes had. I told him that meeting him had cracked something open in me, that I wasn't sure I could close again. We talked for hours, the conversation flowing easy and natural, punctuated by long silences that weren't awkward but comfortable, necessary even. At some point he took my hand again, lacing his fingers through mine, and it felt like the most natural thing in the world. When he kissed me, it was soft and questioning, giving me every chance to pull away. But I didn't pull away. I leaned in, my hand coming up to his jaw, feeling the stubble rough against my palm. He tasted like beer and something sweet, and kissing him felt like finally understanding a language I'd been hearing my whole life, but never quite comprehending. We broke apart, and he rested his forehead against mine, both of us breathing hard. His hand cupped the back of my neck, thumb stroking the sensitive skin there. "Is this okay?" he asked, and I loved him a little bit just for asking. "Yes," I said. "Yes, this is okay." We didn't rush it. Over the next few weeks, we took our time figuring out what we were to each other. I'd come by the shop after work and we'd grab dinner, or he'd come to my apartment and I'd cook something probably too fancy while he'd tease me about my kitchen gadgets. We talked about everything and nothing. We learned each other slowly. The physical part developed naturally, each step feeling right and inevitable. The first time I stayed over at his place, a small apartment above a diner, we lay in his bed, just holding each other, and it felt more intimate than anything I'd experienced before. He traced patterns on my back and I listened to his heartbeat and felt completely at peace. My friends started asking questions about why I was always busy, always smiling at my phone, always distracted. I wasn't ready to tell them yet, wasn't ready to put words to what Barrett and I were doing. But he was patient. He said we could go at whatever pace I needed, that he wasn't going anywhere. The first time I called him my boyfriend was by accident. We were at the hardware store, of all places, because he needed parts for a project, and the clerk asked if we were together. I said, yeah, he's my boyfriend. Without thinking. Barrett's face lit up, and he grabbed my hand right there in the middle of the store, and I realized I didn't care who saw. Coming out to my parents was harder. My mom cried. Not because she was upset, but because she said so much suddenly made sense about me, about why I'd always seemed like I was holding something back. My dad was quieter about it, but he shook Barrett's hand when I finally brought him home, and said anyone who makes you smile like that is all right by me. Barrett introduced me to his friends, other guys from the garage and the auto parts store, and they welcomed me without question. I introduced him to my design colleagues at a gallery opening, and watching him navigate that world with the same confidence he showed in his garage made me fall even harder. We had our first real fight about 3 months in. Something stupid about scheduling and miscommunication. And I was terrified it meant everything was falling apart. But we talked through it. Really talked. And came out the other side, stronger. He taught me that conflict didn't mean ending. That working through hard things was part of building something real. One night, lying in bed at his place, he asked me if I ever regretted not figuring this out sooner. I thought about it for a while. Part of me wished I'd had the courage to be honest with myself earlier. But mostly I thought that everything had led me exactly where I needed to be. I wouldn't change it, I told him, because it led me to you. He kissed my shoulder and pulled me closer. I used to think I'd have to choose, he said quietly, between being honest about who I am and having the life I wanted. Like I couldn't have both. I turned to face him, our noses almost touching in the darkness. And now, I asked. Now I have both, he said simply. 6 months in, my car actually did break down for real. Something major with the transmission. Barrett worked on it for 3 days, refusing to charge me, saying it was the least he could do since my car problems had brought us together. I watched him work, still finding it mesmerizing, still feeling that flutter in my chest, when he looked up and caught me staring. When he finished, he wiped his hands and said, "You know, if your car hadn't broken down that day, we might never have met." I walked over to him, wrapped my arms around his waist, not caring that he was covered in grease. Or maybe we would have, I said. Maybe we would have met some other way. He smiled and kissed the top of my head. Maybe, he agreed, but I'm glad it was this way. Looking back now, a year later, I think about how much has changed, how I've changed. I'm more honest with myself, more willing to be vulnerable, more open to possibilities I never let myself consider before. Barrett did that for me. Or maybe I did it for myself and he just showed me how. We're talking about moving in together, finding a place that's ours instead of his or mine. We're planning a trip to meet his family, who he says are going to love me. We're building a life together, slowly and carefully, like Barrett builds everything, with attention and care and steady hands. Sometimes I still can't believe this is my life, that I get to wake up next to this man who showed me who I really am, that I get to love him and be loved by him, that a simple engine light led me to everything I didn't know I needed. I don't think love always happens like in movies, with dramatic declarations and sweeping gestures. Sometimes it happens in the front seat of a car, with tangled legs in a footwell, and oil-stained hands and two people brave enough to admit what they want. Sometimes it happens slowly, carefully, two people learning each other and themselves at the same time. Barrett taught me that it's never too late to be honest about who you are, that love doesn't follow a prescribed path, that sometimes the most important journeys begin with something as mundane as a broken car and a mechanic with green eyes who sees you in a way no one else ever has. I still drive past the shop sometimes, even though Barrett doesn't work there anymore. He opened his own place last month, something smaller and more personal, and I helped him paint the sign. Barrett's Auto Repair, it says, with our phone number underneath. Our phone number. Our life. Our future. And it all started under a dashboard, in a footwell barely big enough for two people, with a question neither of us quite asked, and an answer we both somehow knew. That's where I found him. That's where I found myself. That's where everything began.